In a bustling, high-end restaurant, a diligent and highly respected server named Miles Daniels prepared for another demanding evening. Miles was known for his composed demeanor, even in the face of the toughest clients, and tonight would be no exception. As he adjusted his tie and steadied his breath, he had no idea that this shift would change his life forever. Miles had dealt with difficult patrons before, but this night was different. As he stepped onto the floor, he noticed the unmistakable figure of Vivian Morgan in the corner booth, an executive with a reputation for harsh criticism and a quick temper. Vivian was a regular at the restaurant, and rumors of her complaints and impossible demands often circulated among the staff. She was known not only for her wealth, but for her cold, unapologetic attitude that left servers anxious and exhausted. Tonight, as Miles approached her table, he could feel her gaze burning into him without a hint of acknowledgement. She sat there, scrolling on her phone, barely glancing up as he greeted her politely and asked if she'd like sparkling or still water. "Sparkling," she replied, her tone sharp, as if his question had interrupted something far more important. As Miles walked to the bar, he couldn't shake the sting of her barely veiled disdain. Just as he turned to deliver the water, he overheard Vivian mutter to her companion, "They'll hire just anyone these days. This place used to have standards." Her words struck a nerve. Miles took a breath, reminding himself to stay professional. He had faced similar remarks before, but something about the way Vivian dismissed his existence, as if he were invisible, made his usual calm waver. When he returned to her table, he poured the water with a practiced precision, trying to maintain his composure. This time, she finally looked up, scrutinizing him as if he were an insect that had dared to crawl onto her table. "Are you new?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Miles managed a polite response, explaining he'd worked there for some time. Vivian let out a cold smirk, her eyes flicking over him dismissively. "Doesn't show," she said, returning her attention to her phone. Her meaning was clear, and Miles could feel the anger simmering, but he held his ground, turning away to continue his duties. Miles tried to let it go, focusing on the other patrons who offered genuine smiles and kind words, small gestures that reminded him why he loved his job. But as the evening wore on, Vivian's behavior grew even more brazen. She called him back over with an exaggerated wave, tapping her empty glass loudly on the table as if demanding attention. When he politely asked if she'd like a refill, she sneered, "I thought service standards mattered here, but I guess they don't with your kind." Each of her words was like a deliberate slice, and Miles felt his patience thinning. He wanted to respond, to tell her that he was just as worthy of respect as anyone else in that restaurant. But years of experience had taught him to keep his emotions in check. With a calm voice, he simply asked if there was anything else she needed. But Vivian wasn't done. "Oh, I'm sure you'll get it eventually," she said, her voice loud enough for other patrons to hear. The tension in the room was thick. A few tables glanced over, some patrons clearly uncomfortable with her harshness. Miles felt his hands clench behind his back as he fought to maintain his calm. Vivian's smirk widened, enjoying her power over him, savoring each degrading word as if it were her due. Miles tried to shake it off, tried to let the sting pass, but it clung to him, every insult digging deeper. He continued his rounds, keeping his head high, but each time he passed her table, he could feel her eyes following him, piercing and contemptuous. Finally, as he neared her table once again, she crossed her arms and glared at him. "You people really think you belong here, don't you?" she sneered. Her words were a clear, deliberate reminder of how she saw him, as someone beneath her. Miles stopped, his face calm, but his anger barely contained. He knew he had to stay professional, but a part of him refused to let her go unchecked this time. Just as he began to respond, Vivian's face twisted with rage. She picked up her glass and, in a shocking instant, hurled the contents at him. The icy water splashed across his face and shirt, and the room went silent. Patrons around them gasped, their shocked expressions mirroring Miles's own. He stood there, dripping, his mind reeling. For a moment, he felt his anger surge to the surface, a fire he'd held back all evening. But instead of retreating, he felt something inside him shift, a determination to finally stand up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt degraded and dismissed. "Oh, don't worry," he said, his voice steady but laced with the same sarcasm she'd used on him. "I'll get you that refill, Vivian. After all, I wouldn't want to waste any more of your precious time." Her mouth fell open, stunned by his boldness. She quickly regained her composure, her face contorting with fury. "Who do you think you're talking to?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Someone who expects respect without showing any," Miles replied, his tone unwavering. Vivian's face twisted with rage at Miles' response, her lips curling into a sneer that showed she was not used to being spoken to like this. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat. "Let me remind you, you're here to serve people like me. That's your place. You're nothing but a face on the other side of the table." The tension in the restaurant was palpable, every eye now locked on the scene unfolding. Miles could feel the heat of Vivian's words cutting through him. But this time, something was different. His usual calm had been chipped away piece by piece, and he felt a surge of resolve not to let her walk over him anymore. Gathering his courage, he met her gaze firmly. "Respect is a two-way street, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of truth that struck Vivian silent for a moment. "If you want it, maybe try showing a little first." Vivian's eyes blazed, and for a second, it looked like she might lose control entirely. But before she could respond, a figure emerged from the side of the room. Samuel, the restaurant manager. Samuel's expression was calm, yet stern as he glanced from Miles, soaked and dignified, to Vivian, flushed with fury. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority that silenced the room even further. Vivian seized the opportunity, instantly adopting a tone of righteous indignation. "Yes, there's a problem. This server was incredibly rude, and I demand he be fired immediately. I won't be insulted by someone who should be grateful just to have this job." Samuel's gaze shifted to Miles, taking in the water dripping from his shirt and the fire still in his eyes. Miles stood his ground, feeling a strange calm settle over him. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and he felt a quiet confidence in Samuel's judgment. "Ma'am," Samuel said, turning back to Vivian, "we have a strict policy here against abusive behavior towards our staff. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Vivian's eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open in disbelief. "You're asking me to leave?" Her voice rose, laced with outrage. "I am a paying customer, and I have connections in this city. Do you have any idea who I am?" Samuel remained unmoved. "I'm fully aware, ma'am," he said, his voice resolute. "And this is your final warning. You can either leave quietly, or we'll be happy to refund your meal and ask you not to return." The color drained from Vivian's face, replaced by a deep red flush as she realized she was losing control. Her eyes darted around the restaurant, noting the silent stares of the other patrons, some watching in stunned disbelief, others with quiet approval. She wasn't used to being in a position where her demands went unmet. This was supposed to be a simple power play, and now it was unraveling before her eyes. She let out a bitter laugh, her voice rising with a manic edge. "Fine, call security if you must. Let everyone see how you treat your best clients." But her voice quivered with something unspoken, a desperation she hadn't shown before. She grabbed her coat with exaggerated fury, turning to storm toward the exit. But as she reached the door, she threw one last, venomous look at Miles. "This is why people like you don't belong in places like this," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll never be anything but a server, no matter where they let you work." A heavy silence followed as the door swung shut behind her, the final thud echoing through the room. Miles stood there, his heart pounding, but he felt a strange sense of triumph. For the first time, he had stood his ground without backing down, and the people around him, his coworkers, even the patrons, nodded with silent support. Samuel put a hand on Miles' shoulder, his face softening with respect. "You handled that well. I'm sorry you had to go through it." "Thank you," Miles replied, grateful for the support. "I appreciate it." He returned to his duties, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion, as if he had been carrying an invisible weight for too long. But just when he thought the matter was over, a storm began brewing that he never could have anticipated. The very next day, Miles arrived for his evening shift to find whispers circulating among his coworkers, their eyes darting toward him with expressions of concern. His heart sank slightly as he made his way to the staff area, where Samuel was waiting for him, his face more serious than usual. "Miles," Samuel began, motioning for him to sit, "I just received a call from the management team. It seems that Miss Morgan has filed a formal complaint against you." Miles' stomach dropped. "A complaint?" he echoed, feeling a surge of disbelief. "But everyone saw what happened. She threw a drink at me." "I know, Miles," Samuel reassured him, his expression sympathetic. "But her complaint accuses you of harassment and unprofessional behavior, and she claims you embarrassed her in front of other patrons. She's also," he hesitated, a spark of anger flickering in his eyes. "She's alleging that you acted with racial prejudice against her." Miles felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of frustration and disbelief rising in him. "She's the one who insulted me. Everyone saw how she spoke to me." "Don't worry," Samuel replied, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Management is on our side, and we have the testimonies of patrons who witnessed the incident. They're fully aware of her reputation, and this is not the first complaint of this kind against her. But we have to follow procedure." Miles nodded, though he couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. This was more than just a complaint. It was an attack on his character and integrity. Vivian hadn't been content with humiliating him publicly. She wanted to ruin him completely. Days went by, and though Miles continued his work with the same professionalism, a lingering unease hung over him. He couldn't ignore the constant feeling of being under a microscope. His every move weighed and watched, as if waiting for him to falter. But he wasn't alone. Patrons who had witnessed the scene began to approach him, quietly offering words of support, a small nod of solidarity, or a reassuring smile. His coworkers, too, rallied around him, giving him extra hands with tables or simply reminding him that they stood by him. Finally, after nearly a week, the verdict arrived. Management called him into a meeting where Samuel and several executives sat, their faces reassuring but serious. They had received all the testimonies, reviewed the security footage, and reached a decision. "Miles," one of the executives began, "we want you to know that we're grateful for your professionalism throughout this ordeal. It's clear from the evidence that Miss Morgan's claims are baseless, and we've decided to permanently ban her from our restaurant." Miles felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the relief washing over him. He managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "It means a lot to know that I have your support." The executives exchanged a look before one of them leaned forward. "And Miles," she added, "if there's anything we can do to support you, please let us know. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and we're committed to standing by our staff." Miles left the meeting feeling lighter than he had in days. For the first time, he felt validated and understood, and a new sense of confidence filled him. But just when he thought the worst was behind him, an unexpected visitor arrived that evening, someone he hadn't anticipated seeing ever again. As the evening rush began to settle, Miles moved between tables with a newfound ease, feeling like he'd finally reclaimed his dignity and peace. But as he approached the hostess stand to check on the reservations, his heart skipped a beat. There, standing with a furious glint in her eye, was none other than Vivian Morgan herself. She looked different. Her usually polished, confident demeanor was replaced by something raw and angry. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a rigid set to her jaw that spoke of someone who had come to settle a score. Miles felt a mixture of disbelief and unease as she strode up to him, her eyes burning with indignation. Well, look who's still here," she sneered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I thought I made myself clear, Miles. I can't believe they're actually letting someone like you stay here after what you did to me." Miles took a steadying breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Ma'am, if you're here to dine, please take a seat," he replied calmly, gesturing towards the tables. "Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." Vivian's lips twisted into a mocking smile. "Oh, you think you're in a position to tell me what to do?" she shot back, taking a step closer. "I'm here because I just found out this restaurant had the audacity to ban me, and I intend to let your manager know exactly what I think of that decision." She glanced around, clearly expecting to intimidate both Miles and the rest of the restaurant into submission. But this time, Miles didn't flinch. He stood firm, his posture calm, yet unyielding. You were asked to leave because of how you treated me and others. That's our policy here, and there's no reason to repeat it, he said, his voice steady. Vivian's face reddened, her fists clenching at her sides. Her voice dropped to a low, venomous whisper. You think this place cares about you? The only reason you're still here is because they want to look inclusive. Without that, you'd be cleaning the streets, if even that. Her words cut deep, but Miles refused to let her see his pain. He straightened, meeting her gaze with a confidence he hadn't known he possessed. I'm here because I'm good at my job, he replied, his tone cold and resolute. Something you clearly don't understand. All you know is how to treat people like they're beneath you. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Vivian's face, quickly replaced by a disdainful smirk. Pretending you belong. It's always so obvious with people like you, no matter how hard you try. She leaned in closer, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. The higher you climb, the harder you'll fall. People like me, we've seen it before. You'll always be just the help. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the restaurant's usual ambience. Miles felt the heat of her insult, but this time he didn't look away. He held her gaze, his expression calm, yet defiant. Well, he replied evenly, you may think that, but clearly I'm still standing here. And from where I'm standing, that seems to bother you a lot more than it bothers me. Vivian's expression twisted with rage. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could respond, Samuel approached, his face unreadable, but his presence undeniable. Miss Morgan, he said firmly, we've already addressed this issue. You were banned for your behavior toward our staff, and that decision stands. Her eyes flashed as she turned her fury onto him, as if determined to reclaim control. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? I know people in this city who could ruin this place, she declared, her voice escalating with every word. Samuel remained calm, his tone unwavering. Ma'am, this restaurant upholds respect and equality for all patrons and staff. You violated those values, and that's why we won't be serving you anymore. Vivian scoffed, her arms crossed in defiance. This is all about protecting your little token here, isn't it? She sneered, gesturing at Miles. You're just afraid of bad press, thinking this little act makes you look like heroes. Miles raised an eyebrow, a faint trace of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Or maybe, he said, his voice calm but unyielding, they're just tired of people like you treating others like they're beneath them. Her face flushed, her jaw tightening with fury. You don't belong here, she hissed, her voice barely a whisper but sharp as a knife. You never will. Samuel stepped forward, his voice clear and resolute. Miss Morgan, if you refuse to leave, we'll have no choice but to call security. Vivian let out a bitter laugh, her tone laced with desperation. Oh, don't worry, I'll leave, she shot back, her eyes darting around the restaurant. But don't think for a second this is over. You people will never get it, thinking you can belong in places like this. She spun on her heel, storming towards the door with one final glare aimed at Miles. But as the door closed behind her, a hush fell over the room. Miles felt a strange sense of release as he watched her leave, a realization settling over him. For so long, people like Vivian had tried to make him feel small, as if he didn't belong. But now, he understood that he didn't have to prove his worth to anyone, especially not to someone as small-minded as her. The rest of the evening went by in a blur, with patrons occasionally glancing at him, some offering sympathetic smiles or words of encouragement. Miles couldn't help but feel a newfound strength, a quiet pride in himself that couldn't be shaken. The next day, however, brought yet another unexpected turn. As Miles entered the restaurant, he noticed Samuel waiting for him with an expression that hinted at something important. Miles, he began, gesturing toward the office. We received a call from the HR department at Morgan Consulting. Miles felt a flicker of surprise. Vivian's company? Samuel nodded. Apparently, someone witnessed the incident and reported it to her employer. They're investigating her behavior, and they've asked if you'd be willing to provide an account of what happened. Miles felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with disbelief. He had a rare opportunity to finally hold Vivian accountable for her actions. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "And if they need proof, we have the security footage." Later that week, Miles found himself standing outside the sleek, glass-covered building of Morgan Consulting. The receptionist led him to a conference room, where he was met by Pauline Simmons, the head of HR. She offered him a warm, professional smile as she gestured for him to sit. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Daniels," she said, her tone sincere. "We've received concerning reports about Miss Morgan's conduct, and we want to ensure we have a full understanding of the situation." Miles appreciated her professionalism and nodded, sharing the details of what had occurred. He described the derogatory remarks, the escalating tension, and the moment she threw her drink at him, recounting each incident with calm clarity. As he spoke, he noticed Pauline's expression shift, a mixture of disapproval and concern flashing across her face. Just as he was finishing his account, the door swung open, and in walked Vivian herself. Her face darkened upon seeing him, and she let out a bitter laugh. "So, this is what it's come to?" she scoffed, taking a seat across from him with a defiant glare. "I can't believe you're actually entertaining his story." Pauline remained unfazed. "Miss Morgan," she said calmly, "we are here to gather information from all involved parties. I expect you to remain professional." Vivian crossed her arms, scoffing. "Professional? This is absurd. I was simply expecting a level of respect, and instead, I was humiliated by a staff member who has no place in that establishment." Miles held her gaze, unyielding. "I was polite until you crossed the line." Vivian rolled her eyes dismissively, but Pauline held up a hand. "Mr. Daniels mentioned that there's security footage of the incident. I'd like to review it." Miles pulled out his phone, connecting it to a screen. The footage played, clearly showing Vivian's aggressive body language, her demeaning remarks, and the moment she threw her drink at him. Pauline's face hardened as she watched, her professionalism now laced with a sense of disappointment. Turning to Vivian, she spoke with a firm but calm tone. "Miss Morgan, your behavior is in direct violation of our company's values, and it reflects poorly on us all. Given the severity of this incident, we are suspending you effective immediately, pending further review." Vivian's face contorted with rage as she pointed a trembling finger at Miles. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "This little display isn't going to get you anywhere. You're still nothing but a server." Miles met her gaze steadily. "I think everyone here sees exactly who you are, Vivian, and I don't need to be anything other than myself to earn respect." Pauline stepped in, her voice unyielding. "Miss Morgan, please leave the premises immediately. Security will escort you out if necessary." Vivian's mouth dropped open in shock, but after a tense silence, she rose, snatching her purse and throwing one last hateful look at Miles. "You people will never belong," she spat before storming out, her heels clicking furiously on the polished floor. As she disappeared through the door, Miles felt a wave of relief. He had faced Vivian at her own company and watched her finally confront the consequences of her actions. It was a rare moment of justice, and he knew he'd taken a stand, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated like he was invisible. When Pauline turned back to him, her expression softened. "Thank you for coming forward, Mr. Daniels. I hope this experience reminds us all that actions have consequences. If you ever consider a career shift, I'd be more than happy to discuss opportunities with you. We could use more people with integrity." Miles left the building feeling as though he had shed an old weight. He had spoken his truth and been heard. As Miles walked away from Morgan Consulting, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't expected. The city was alive with the sounds of the late afternoon, people bustling on their way. But for him, the world seemed quieter, calmer. He had taken a stand and been seen for who he was, someone who demanded respect without needing titles or status. Over the next few days, word of the incident spread quietly through his restaurant. Colleagues offered small gestures of solidarity, a hand on his shoulder, a warm smile, a "good for you, man." The patrons, too, seemed different. Some, having heard the story, approached him with encouragement, sharing their own stories of standing up against prejudice. Miles felt that sense of camaraderie deepen, reminding him that he was not alone. But as he returned to his usual routine, a thought kept surfacing. It was as if the whole encounter had unlocked something within him, a confidence he hadn't realized he'd needed. For the first time, he saw his work not just as a job, but as a place where he belonged, where he had earned his place, fair and square. One quiet evening, as the dinner rush slowed, Samuel approached him with a curious expression, a slight grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Miles," he began, "there's someone here who'd like to speak with you." Miles looked up, surprised, and followed Samuel to the front of the restaurant. Standing near the hostess stand was Pauline Simmons from Morgan Consulting, the same HR executive who had suspended Vivian. She noticed him and smiled warmly, extending her hand. "Mr. Daniels," she greeted him, "I wanted to stop by and thank you in person, to let you know the outcome of Miss Morgan's case." Miles shook her hand, surprised but intrigued. "Thank you, Miss Simmons," he replied. "I appreciate you taking the time to let me know." Pauline's smile softened, and she nodded. "Vivian Morgan will no longer be with the company. Her actions went against everything we stand for, and after a full investigation, we felt it best to part ways." Miles felt an unexpected sense of closure. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure if anything would come of it, but I'm glad her actions caught up with her." Pauline glanced around the restaurant, observing the warm atmosphere and the clear respect between the staff and customers. "Your manager and team spoke highly of you, Miles," she added. "It's clear you're respected here, and I can see why." There was a beat of silence, and then, with a slightly mischievous glint, she leaned closer. "We could use someone like you, actually," she said, her voice both serious and inviting. "If you ever consider a change, I'd be more than happy to arrange an interview. We need team members who stand up for what's right, who represent integrity. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Miles was taken aback, feeling a swell of gratitude he hadn't expected. That's very generous of you," he stammered, smiling in spite of himself. "Thank you. I'll definitely keep it in mind." With a final handshake, Pauline left the restaurant, and Miles watched her go, a faint smile lingering on his face. The offer felt like a validation of everything he'd gone through, and it reminded him that respect was something you could command just by being true to yourself. As the weeks passed, life settled into a familiar rhythm. Miles continued working at the restaurant, his sense of confidence deepening with each passing day. But he noticed something else. His story had quietly inspired others. Some patrons recognized him and offered words of encouragement, thanking him for standing up for dignity and respect. Others shared their own experiences with prejudice, moments where they, too, had felt unseen or dismissed. Miles realized that his actions had resonated far beyond that single confrontation. His colleagues respected him not just as a co-worker, but as someone who had proven that dignity mattered more than status or wealth. One crisp evening, as he was locking up the restaurant, Samuel approached him, clapping a friendly hand on his shoulder. "Proud of you, Miles," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You handled all of it with such grace. You've set an example for all of us." Miles smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Thanks, Samuel. I just hope it makes a difference. Maybe help someone else see that they don't have to put up with people like her." Samuel grinned, nodding. "Trust me, it already has." They finished closing up, and as Miles walked out into the cool evening air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of freedom. He knew that whatever came next, he'd face it with his head held high. But just as he turned to walk home, he heard a voice ring out behind him. Well, look who thinks he's somebody." Miles turned, his heart sinking. There, standing under the streetlight, was Vivian. She looked different. Her clothes were slightly worn, her face tight with anger and bitterness. The polished, confident veneer was gone, replaced by a hardness that seemed to have carved new lines into her face. Miles straightened, keeping his expression calm. "Didn't expect to see you here, Vivian," he said, his tone steady. "Out for a walk?" Vivian's face twisted, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she sneered. "Thinking you've won, or whatever nonsense you tell yourself. I hope you're enjoying your little victory, because it won't last." Miles sighed, the tension from the past weeks settling heavily in his chest. "Vivian, it's over. Move on." But she shook her head, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "People like you don't get to tell people like me how to behave," she spat, her tone dripping with disdain. "You think I don't know what you did? You ran to my company like a sniveling little tattletale. And look where it got you, still nothing but a waiter." Miles felt his patience thinning, but he held his ground. "I don't need to be anything else, Vivian. Respect isn't something you buy. It's something you earn." Her face flushed, and she took a step closer, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You have no idea what you've taken from me," she yelled, her voice sharp enough to turn a few heads of people passing by. "I had a career, a life. I had respect in this city, and you ruined it because you couldn't handle a little criticism." Miles raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but unyielding. "Criticism? Vivian, you treated me like I was invisible, like I didn't matter. You lost your job because you refused to see other people as equals." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh, taking another step closer. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" she sneered. "You pathetic, entitled little nobody. That's all you are, a nobody who got lucky once." Miles felt a flicker of something shift inside him, and for the first time, he felt nothing but pity for her. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I am lucky. Lucky to finally be free from people like you." Vivian's fist clenched, and without warning, she shoved him hard, catching him off guard. Miles staggered back, but quickly regained his balance, his face remaining calm as he looked at her. People had begun to stop, watching the scene unfold, and a few even took out their phones, capturing the confrontation. Vivian noticed them too, but the anger in her eyes seemed too overwhelming to care. "You don't belong here," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You never did, and you never will." Miles took a breath, and then, with quiet conviction, he replied, "Maybe, but at least I know who I am." Vivian's face contorted with rage, her voice rising even higher. "You think you're some kind of hero? All you are is a smug, self-important pest who got a lucky break. You're nothing." But as the crowd continued to gather, her voice faltered, the venom in her words falling flat. People in the street began to murmur, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others openly supportive of Miles. Vivian noticed their reactions, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. Her gaze darted between Miles and the onlookers, as if realizing for the first time how she appeared. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. Instead, she pointed at him once more, her tone desperate. "People like you will never belong in places like this." Miles, feeling the weight of her words lift, gave her one last steady look. "Funny," he said, "because I feel like I belong here more than ever." Just then, two police officers arrived, stepping through the crowd. The taller officer looked between Vivian's furious face and Miles' calm demeanor, assessing the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm. Vivian instantly turned to the officers, her voice frantic. "He's harassing me, following me around, trying to ruin my life." The officer glanced at Miles, who simply shook his head, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "Officer, I was just walking home when she confronted me. There are plenty of witnesses here." A few people in the crowd nodded, and some spoke up. "She's been yelling and pushing him," one woman called out. "He didn't do anything wrong." The officer turned back to Vivian, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, is that true? Did you initiate this confrontation?" Vivian's face reddened, her voice faltering. "He's lying. I was defending myself." The second officer, who had been reviewing footage from bystanders' phones, shook his head. "Ma'am, we have enough evidence here that you were the aggressor." The color drained from Vivian's face as she processed the officer's words. For a moment, it looked as if she might try to argue, but the reality of the situation settled heavily over her. She glanced at the crowd surrounding her, their faces a mixture of pity, judgment, and disbelief. It was clear that any attempt to twist the story would fall flat, and the weight of this realization left her visibly shaken. The taller officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his tone now curt and direct. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for assault and disturbing the peace." Vivian's face twisted with horror, her voice rising in a desperate plea. "You're arresting me, Frem?" She gestured wildly at Miles, as if the thought of being reprimanded because of him was the ultimate humiliation. The officer's expression remained unmoved as he calmly responded, "Yes, ma'am. Now, please turn around and put your hands behind your back." The crowd was utterly silent, save for a few gasps and murmurs. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed, her face flushed with panic and disbelief as she began to realize the depth of her fall. She cast one last, venomous look at Miles, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You're nothing, just trash trying to play in a world that doesn't belong to you." Miles met her gaze, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over him. He didn't need to respond. Her words were now powerless, their sting long gone. The crowd could see her for who she was, and there was nothing she could say or do to change that. Vivian's tirade, once a weapon, was now only an echo. As the officers led her toward their patrol car, her protests grew more desperate. "I know people," she screamed, her voice filled with a frantic edge. "This isn't over. You'll regret this. All of you." But the crowd's silence was unbreakable. People watched her with expressions that ranged from pity to indifference, as if they were witnessing the crumbling of something long past its time. Some even pulled out their phones, recording the scene, capturing the final moments of her fall from grace. As Vivian was guided into the police car, a few people approached Miles, patting him on the back, offering murmurs of support. "Good for you, man," one person said. She had it coming. Another bystander, a middle-aged woman, gave him an encouraging smile. It's about time someone stood up to people like her. Miles offered them a quiet nod, grateful for their words but still processing everything that had just happened. It felt surreal. Vivian, the woman who once wielded her status and wealth like a shield, was now sitting in the back of a police car, powerless. She had built her world on superiority, on a sense of entitlement that could no longer shield her from the truth. And for the first time, Miles felt that he was truly free of her shadow. The officers closed the car door, and as the vehicle pulled away, a sense of closure washed over him. The weight of all those years, all those moments he'd swallowed his pride in the face of people like Vivian, finally lifted. He had faced her down, and in doing so, he had faced down all the prejudice, the arrogance, and the entitlement she represented. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Miles took a deep breath, savoring the cool evening air and the calm that came with it. He felt an unexpected sense of pride, knowing that he hadn't just stood up for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or belittled. This wasn't just his victory. It was a moment that represented something far larger. Later that evening, he returned home and sat quietly in his small but cozy apartment, replaying the events of the night in his mind. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, triumph, and even a hint of sadness. He realized that, despite everything, he didn't feel anger toward Vivian anymore. If anything, he felt pity. For all her wealth and status, she was someone imprisoned by her own arrogance, someone who believed her power could shield her from accountability. She had learned nothing, and in her refusal to change, she had lost everything that once made her feel powerful. For the first time in his life, Miles understood that her words, her power, had been an illusion, a facade that crumbled the moment he chose to stand his ground. In the days that followed, the story spread across his workplace and even beyond. Colleagues approached him, some sharing stories of similar encounters, others simply offering words of support. His manager, Samuel, took him aside one evening, a proud smile on his face. "You've done something powerful, Miles. You've shown all of us that respect is something we can demand, not just hope for." Miles felt a wave of gratitude as he looked around at the team that had supported him through everything. "Thank you, Samuel," he replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I just did what felt right, and he knew it was true." Standing up to Vivian hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming his own sense of worth, about proving to himself and others that dignity wasn't something granted by status or wealth. It was something that came from within, something earned through integrity. Weeks turned into months, and life returned to its familiar rhythm, but with one crucial difference. Miles now walked through the restaurant with a quiet confidence, a newfound sense of belonging that no one could take away. Patrons noticed the change too, treating him with a respect that was almost palpable. They saw him not just as a server, but as someone who had demanded his place in the world, who had stood for something greater than himself. And then, one crisp autumn evening, he received an unexpected visit. As he was finishing up his shift, Samuel approached him, a mysterious smile on his face. "Miles," he said, "there's someone here who would like to see you." Curious, Miles made his way to the front of the restaurant, where he found Pauline Simmons waiting for him once again. She greeted him with the same warm smile and extended her hand. "Good evening, Miles," she said, her tone kind but tinged with something more, a sense of purpose. "I came by to check in and to see how you've been." Miles shook her hand, feeling a renewed sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Pauline. I've been well, actually. Things have changed a lot since our last meeting." Pauline nodded, glancing around the restaurant with a look of appreciation. "I can see that. Your team speaks very highly of you, you know, and that's actually why I'm here." She paused, giving him a thoughtful look. "Our company has been through some changes recently, and we're looking for people who embody the values we stand for: integrity, resilience, respect. I wanted to offer you a position if you're interested." Miles blinked, taken completely by surprise. You're offering me a job?" he asked, unable to hide his astonishment. "Yes," Pauline replied, her smile growing warmer. "I believe you'd be a tremendous asset to our team. And more importantly, I think you've shown us all what it means to stand up for what's right." Miles felt a surge of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the journey he had taken to get here, the courage it had taken to demand respect, and the strength he had found within himself along the way. I'd be honored," he said finally, a smile spreading across his face. As they finalized the details, Miles couldn't help but feel a profound sense of fulfillment. He had started out as someone who was used to blending into the background, someone who had quietly endured the disrespect of people like Vivian. But through each challenge, he had discovered his own power, his own voice. And now, he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where he could continue to stand up for himself and others, where he could make a difference. That night, as he walked home under the autumn sky, he felt the weight of his journey settle comfortably on his shoulders. He had not only survived but thrived, proving to himself that he was more than anyone's expectations of him. Miles Daniels had reclaimed his dignity, and in doing so, he had finally found his place in the world, on his own terms. In the weeks that followed, Miles embraced his new position at Pauline's company with a deep sense of purpose. He was surrounded by colleagues who valued his insight and respected his journey, people who saw him as a peer rather than a subordinate. Every morning, he walked into the glass-walled office building with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the hardest moments of his life. But one afternoon, as he was settling into his work, an email popped up on his screen from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was stark and simple. "To the man who ruined my life." Miles felt a twinge of unease, his mind flashing back to the last time he'd seen Vivian. He took a steadying breath and clicked it open. The message was short, but each word dripped with anger and bitterness. Asterisk, "I hope you're proud of yourself. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? All you've done is destroy everything I built. You'll pay for this. Just wait." Asterisk. Miles closed the email, feeling a strange mixture of pity and frustration. Despite everything, Vivian was still clinging to her version of reality, one where she was the victim. He knew she wouldn't simply fade away without a fight, but he also knew that her threats were hollow. She had lost her power, and whatever control she thought she had over him was gone. Later that evening, as he recounted the message to Pauline, she offered him a knowing smile. "Some people can't accept the consequences of their own actions," she said gently. "But remember, Miles, you're here because of your integrity. You earned your place, and no one can take that away." Her words were a balm to him, reminding him that he was where he was because of his own strength and perseverance, not because of the favor or influence of others. For the first time, he felt that he could finally leave Vivian and her anger in the past, moving forward without looking back. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't quite done with him yet. A few weeks later, on an unassuming Friday afternoon, as Miles was preparing for a presentation, he received a call from Samuel, his former manager at the restaurant. "Miles," Samuel's voice sounded hesitant but warm. "I hope this isn't a bad time, but I have a favor to ask. You can come by the restaurant tonight? We have a special guest, and I think it's something you might want to be here for." Curiosity piqued, Miles agreed. After work, he made his way to the familiar restaurant, a place that had once been his second home. As he stepped inside, memories flooded him. The laughter of coworkers, the polite hum of patrons, and of course, the darker encounters that had shaped him. It felt strange to be back, but comforting too, like slipping into an old chapter of his life. When he saw Samuel waiting for him, Miles was struck by the excitement and a hint of nervousness in his old manager's eyes. Samuel quickly led him to a private dining room where a small group of patrons sat, including a woman dressed in a crisp suit, her face radiating a quiet warmth. She stood as he entered, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Miles, I'm Rebecca's mother," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "I wanted to meet you." The room fell silent. Miles felt a jolt of surprise mixed with a tinge of unease. "Rebecca's mother? The woman who had raised someone like Vivian? I've heard a lot about you," she continued, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite place. Maybe regret, maybe pride. "Rebecca and I, well, we've had our struggles, especially after everything that happened. But I wanted to meet the person who showed her that actions have consequences, that respect matters." Miles was taken aback. This was the last thing he had expected. A mother seeking him out, wanting to talk about the very confrontation that had turned their lives upside down. "I don't know what to say," he replied slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "I never intended to disrupt anyone's life. I just wanted respect." Her face softened, and she nodded with understanding. "Miles, you didn't disrupt her life. You gave her a lesson no one else could. And for that, I'm grateful. I'm here because I wanted to see the person who, in many ways, might have saved her." Rebecca's mother went on to explain that since the incident, Vivian had struggled to reconcile the consequences of her actions. The loss of her job and reputation had forced her to confront her arrogance in a way she had never before. Her mother spoke of the countless arguments, the defensive anger, and finally, the slow but painful process of reflection that had started to change her daughter. Vivian, she said, was beginning to see the cracks in her own armor. "She's not there yet," her mother admitted, her voice wavering slightly. "But she started counseling, and she's learning that respect isn't something she can demand. It's something she has to give." Miles listened in silence, his emotions churning. He had never imagined that his actions would lead to such a transformation, even a small one, in someone as resistant as Vivian. For so long, he had thought of her as the enemy, a person who would never change. But now, hearing her mother's words, he realized that maybe, just maybe, change was possible, even for someone like her. Rebecca's mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady and filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Miles," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for being the person who finally held up the mirror. I don't know if she'll ever say it herself, but from the bottom of my heart, thank you." Miles felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of peace and closure he hadn't realized he needed. He hadn't set out to change Vivian, only to stand up for himself. But in doing so, he had set off a ripple he could never have anticipated. They shared a quiet moment, a mutual understanding passing between them. Miles saw in her eyes the hope that maybe her daughter could find her way, that she could learn to build a new life grounded in respect and empathy rather than entitlement. As they parted, Rebecca's mother left him with a final thought, one that lingered long after she had gone. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we have to lose everything to find who we really are." Miles left the restaurant feeling lighter, his steps carrying him into the cool night air with a renewed sense of purpose. It was as if the last remnants of the past had finally fallen away, leaving him free to embrace the future with open arms. He had grown beyond the hurt, beyond the anger, and now he knew that his journey was about more than just his own story. It was about the impact he could have even in the lives of those who had once tried to diminish him. The night sky stretched vast and clear above him, and as he looked up, he felt a profound sense of belonging, not just in his career, not just in his accomplishments, but in himself. As Miles walked home that night, the words of Rebecca's mother lingered in his mind. He thought of how life had a strange way of surprising him, pushing him toward growth in ways he hadn't anticipated. For so long, he had felt caught in a cycle, working tirelessly, blending into the background, letting insults slide off him for the sake of peace. But now, he felt as though he had stepped into a new chapter, one where his voice and actions truly mattered. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of clarity. There was something he had been wanting to do for a long time, a dream he had pushed aside because it hadn't seemed possible. But with everything that had unfolded, he realized that he no longer wanted to wait. Life had shown him that he was stronger and more capable than he'd ever imagined, and he wanted to use that strength to make a difference on a larger scale. That evening, he met with Pauline at a nearby coffee shop. She had become a mentor to him over the past few months, guiding him through his new role at her company and supporting his growth. As they sat down, she could sense there was something on his mind. "Miles, you look like you're on the verge of a big decision," she said, a knowing smile on her face. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before he spoke. "I've been thinking about going back to school. I want to study psychology, maybe even become a counselor. After everything that's happened, I feel like I want to help people who might be struggling with the same things I did: self-worth, dignity, respect. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, but I never thought it could really happen." Pauline's eyes sparkled with encouragement. "Miles, I think that's a fantastic idea. You have a natural empathy and strength that people gravitate towards. With your experiences, you'd bring a perspective that can really change lives." Miles felt a rush of excitement mixed with nerves. "It feels right," he admitted, "but it's a big step, and honestly, it's a bit scary. I'd be starting over in a way." Pauline reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his. "Starting over doesn't mean going backward," she said warmly. "It means moving forward with purpose. And if anyone is ready for this journey, it's you." They spent the evening discussing his plans, and for the first time, Miles allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the limitations he had once felt. The idea of studying, of delving into the world of psychology and understanding the human mind filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. He could use his experiences not just to improve his own life, but to inspire others to stand up for themselves, to find their own strength. As the weeks passed, he began taking the steps necessary to enroll in a program. He balanced work with night classes, studying whenever he could, pouring himself into each lecture and assignment. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he wanted to be a voice for those who felt unseen, those who had ever been told they didn't belong. One evening, as he was preparing to leave class, a young woman approached him hesitantly. She had been in a few of his classes, but they hadn't spoken much beyond polite greetings. "Excuse me, Miles?" she asked, her voice soft but determined. "I just wanted to say, your story inspired me. I heard about what happened at the restaurant and how you stood up for yourself. It made me realize I could do the same in my own life." Miles looked at her, struck by the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "That means a lot. I think we all have moments where we feel like we have to stand up and claim our space." She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her initial shyness. "I've been dealing with my own struggles at work. Hearing about your courage reminded me that I don't have to accept being treated as less than. So, thank you, really." As she walked away, Miles felt an overwhelming sense of pride and purpose. It was moments like this, he realized, that fueled his passion for this new path. He was seeing the impact of his actions ripple outward, touching people's lives in ways he hadn't imagined. The months flew by, and with each class, each interaction, Miles grew more confident in his abilities and his vision. He spent countless hours studying, working on projects, and diving into the complexities of human behavior. His professors noticed his dedication, and his peers began to look to him for guidance and support, seeing in him a role model who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. One day, He received an email from Pauline with an unexpected subject line: guest speaker opportunity. Curious, he opened it, and his eyes widened as he read her message. She had been asked to organize a seminar on resilience and integrity in the workplace and wanted him to be one of the featured speakers. Miles felt a surge of both excitement and nervousness. The thought of speaking to an audience about his journey was both exhilarating and daunting. But he knew this was an opportunity to share his story on a larger scale, to show others that strength came from within, regardless of titles or positions. On the day of the seminar, Miles took the stage, his heart pounding but his spirit steady. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he saw a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and respect. He began by sharing his journey, his experiences as a server, the challenges he faced, and the moment he decided to stand up for himself against Vivian's prejudice. He spoke candidly about the fear, the courage, and the sense of self-worth he had found along the way. "But this journey isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. "It's about everyone who has ever felt invisible, dismissed, or belittled. Respect isn't something we ask for. It's something we demand by being true to ourselves." The room was silent, each word resonating deeply with the audience. He could see the impact of his story in their expressions, the glint of recognition in their eyes as they connected with his message. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, and Miles felt a swell of pride unlike anything he had experienced before. After the seminar, people lined up to speak with him, to shake his hand, to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. One young man approached him with tears in his eyes, explaining that he had been mistreated at his workplace, but had felt powerless to speak up. "After hearing you," the man said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I feel like I can finally stand up for myself. Thank you, Miles. Thank you for showing me that I have a voice." Miles left the seminar that evening with his heart full, knowing that his story had inspired others to find their own strength. It was a feeling of fulfillment that went beyond career success. It was a deeper, more personal satisfaction that he had made a real difference. As he continued his journey, he realized that his life had transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The boy who had once worked in the shadows was now a man who stood in the light, a man who had found his place in the world. And though the road had been challenging, he knew it had shaped him into someone who could inspire, uplift, and empower others. In the end, Miles had discovered that the greatest power lay not in titles or wealth, but in the courage to be true to oneself. He had finally found a sense of belonging that no one could take from him, and he knew that his journey was only just beginning. As the months passed, Miles found himself thriving in both his studies and his role as a counselor in training. He had become someone others looked up to, a figure of quiet resilience who had transformed his personal battles into a source of inspiration for everyone around him. His journey was reaching people in ways he had never dreamed possible, and with each story he heard, he felt the significance of his work deepen. One evening, after finishing a session with a group of young adults at a community center, Miles was gathering his things when he saw a familiar face standing hesitantly by the door. It was Rebecca. Her appearance was subdued. Her once meticulously put-together look was replaced by a more natural, even vulnerable presence. She approached him slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of nervousness and what almost looked like remorse. "Miles," she began, her voice soft, barely a whisper. "I've been wanting to reach out for a while now. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me." Miles paused, absorbing the surprising turn of events. He never thought he'd see her again, much less under these circumstances. He nodded gently, inviting her to sit down. "Rebecca," he said, his tone calm and welcoming, "what brings you here?" She let out a shaky breath, her hands twisting together. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But I wanted to try to explain myself. Not to excuse what I did, but I realized that I've hurt so many people, and I didn't see it until I lost everything." Miles listened intently, surprised by the raw honesty in her voice. He could see she was struggling, not just with regret, but with the weight of her own self-realization. "I was raised to believe that my success, my power, meant everything," she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. But losing my job, my reputation, it's forced me to see things differently. I've been going to counseling, and I've started to understand that I use people. I saw them as tools to make myself feel better. And I'm ashamed of that. There was a pause as her words lingered in the air, raw and unfiltered. Miles saw a side of her he had never seen before, a vulnerability that hinted at the possibility of change. He felt a mixture of compassion and cautious hope, aware that this was just the beginning for her. "Rebecca," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm, "self-awareness is a powerful first step. It's not an easy journey, but it sounds like you're starting to face the truth about yourself. And that's something worth acknowledging." She looked up, her eyes filled with a cautious gratitude. "Thank you, Miles. Hearing that from you, it means more than I can say." She hesitated, taking a deep breath. "I don't expect forgiveness, but if there's any way I can make amends, even a little, I want to try." Miles nodded thoughtfully. "Making amends is about more than words, Rebecca. It's about actions. It's about living each day differently, treating people with respect and empathy, not because it benefits you, but because it's the right thing to do." She nodded, absorbing his words with a solemn expression. "I understand," she said, her voice steadying. "Thank you for listening to me, even after everything." They parted ways that evening, and as Miles watched her go, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He knew that true change was a long road, but he had seen a spark in her eyes, a genuine desire to become better. It reminded him of his own journey, of the moments when he had faced his own fears and insecurities, and he realized that perhaps everyone deserved a chance to redeem themselves, to grow beyond their past mistakes. Days turned into weeks, and as the holiday season approached, Miles found himself reflecting on the year with a profound sense of gratitude. He had come so far, from a quiet server who once struggled to assert himself, to a voice of strength and compassion, inspiring others to find their own courage. He realized that each struggle, each confrontation, had shaped him into someone he could truly be proud of. One evening, as he was leaving the office, Pauline caught up with him, a mischievous grin on her face. "Miles," she began, "how do you feel about giving a talk at a leadership conference?" He raised an eyebrow, taken aback. "A leadership conference? Me?" "Yes, you," she said with a laugh. "They're looking for someone who can speak about resilience, integrity, and overcoming adversity. I can't think of anyone more qualified than you." Miles felt a mix of excitement and nerves bubbling up inside him. A leadership conference meant a larger audience, more people who might resonate with his story. It was a chance to reach others who might be struggling, people who needed to hear that they weren't alone. "I'd be honored," he replied, a smile breaking across his face. "Thank you, Pauline." The months leading up to the conference were filled with preparation. Miles worked tirelessly on his speech, carefully crafting each word to ensure it captured his journey, his struggles, and his newfound strength. He practiced in front of his friends, his colleagues, even in front of the mirror, pouring his heart into every sentence. Finally, the day of the conference arrived. Miles stood backstage, his heart pounding with anticipation. He took a steadying breath, reminding himself of the path that had brought him here. The applause from the audience quieted as he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights illuminating the faces looking back at him with expectation. He began by sharing his story, the moments of doubt and resilience, the journey from invisibility to strength. He spoke of the day he had faced Vivian, the fear he had felt, and the courage he had found to stand his ground. But the real lesson, he said, his voice carrying a weight of conviction, wasn't just about standing up to someone who looked down on me. It was about learning to see myself as worthy of respect, to find a sense of dignity that no one could take from me. The audience listened in rapt silence, his words resonating deeply. He could see the expressions of understanding, the quiet nods, the glint of recognition in their eyes. He closed with a thought that had become his guiding principle, a reminder for anyone who had ever felt small or unseen. True strength, he said, isn't found in status or power. It's found in standing by your values, even when it's difficult, even when others try to make you feel less. It's about knowing that respect is something we demand not with anger, but with unwavering dignity. As he stepped off the stage, the applause erupted, echoing through the hall. Miles felt a wave of emotion, pride and fulfillment swelling within him. He had reached people, touched their lives, and in doing so, he had discovered his own. After the conference, attendees approached him, sharing their own stories of struggle, their own battles with self-worth and respect. Each conversation filled him with a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his journey was part of something much larger, a ripple that was spreading, touching lives he might never have expected. As he left the event, he couldn't help but feel that he had come full circle. The boy who had once stayed silent, who had let others define his worth, had now become a man who spoke with clarity, with strength, with compassion. And he knew that this was only the beginning of the legacy he wanted to build. That night, as he walked under the stars, Miles felt a quiet joy settle over him, a sense of belonging that came not from external validation, but from within. He had found his path, and he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same courage and integrity that had brought him this far. The world was vast, and he was ready to embrace every part of it. A few weeks after the conference, Miles returned to his usual routine, but his life now carried a new, quiet momentum. People from the conference had reached out to him, thanking him for his words and sharing how his story had inspired them. He felt deeply fulfilled, but there was a subtle sense of anticipation, as if life had yet another chapter in store for him. One afternoon, as he was working through a particularly busy day at the counseling center, his phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. Curious, he picked it up. Miles Daniels speaking, he answered. A familiar voice hesitated on the other end. Hi, it's Rebecca. The unexpectedness of her call left him momentarily speechless. It had been months since he'd last seen her, and while he had appreciated the conversation with her mother, he had assumed that would be the last connection between them. He took a steadying breath, preparing himself for whatever this call might bring. Rebecca, he replied, his tone neutral but open. What can I do for you? I wasn't sure if I should call, she began, her voice carrying a nervous energy. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I've been working on myself, really working on myself, and I wanted to ask, would you meet with me? Just once? Her request caught him off guard, and he felt a mixture of emotions rising within him. Part of him wanted to move on, to leave the past firmly behind, but another part sensed that this meeting might be significant, that perhaps it was the final piece in a story that had shaped both of them in unexpected ways. After a brief pause, he replied, All right, Rebecca, let's meet. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown. When Miles arrived, he saw her already seated at a small table by the window, her posture more relaxed than he'd ever seen. As he approached, she offered a tentative smile, and he could see a vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Thank you for coming, she said as he sat down, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. I know it must have been difficult to agree to this. Miles nodded, observing her closely. I'm here, Rebecca. So, what did you want to talk about? She hesitated, searching for the right words. I know I've said this before, but I've realized things about myself that I never saw before. I've been working with a counselor, someone who's helped me understand how much harm I caused, not just to you, but to everyone I thought I was above. It's been painful, to say the least. Miles nodded, listening intently as she spoke. He could hear the remorse in her voice, a depth that seemed sincere and raw. I've come to understand, she continued, her voice almost trembling, that I was living my life in a way that hurt everyone around me. I was so blinded by my own ego that I never saw the humanity in others. And I see now that you were the one who showed me how wrong I was. She looked down, gathering herself before meeting his gaze. I know that an apology isn't enough, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I wanted you to know that you changed my life. I wanted to thank you for standing up to me, for forcing me to confront myself. Miles felt a surge of emotions he hadn't expected. He had never imagined that he'd hear these words from her, that she'd acknowledge her past so openly. He took a deep breath, searching for his own words. Rebecca, he began gently, I appreciate you sharing this with me. It's not easy to confront our flaws, especially the ones that hurt others. But what matters is what you do moving forward. It's about becoming someone who sees people as they are, with respect and empathy. She nodded, a small smile breaking through her expression. I've been volunteering at a shelter downtown, working with people I used to think weren't worth my time, but they've taught me so much about resilience, about kindness. It's like I'm seeing the world for the first time. Miles couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride, not in her transformation itself, but in the fact that he had been part of a story that had led her to this new perspective. He saw that the spark of redemption was genuine, that she was striving to create a life filled with purpose and humility. As they sat there, he felt a sense of closure settling over him. She had been a chapter in his life, one that had challenged him, broken him down, and rebuilt him in ways he couldn't have foreseen. But now, they had both moved on, both grown, each in their own way. I think you're on the right path, Rebecca, he said finally, his tone sincere. And I hope you continue to find purpose in it. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, a mutual understanding passing between them. As they said their goodbyes, Miles felt that a weight had lifted, not only for her, but for him as well. They were both free, each able to move forward without the shadows of the past holding them back. Over the next few months, Miles threw himself into his work with a renewed vigor. His counseling sessions became more impactful, each conversation carrying a deeper empathy that resonated with his clients. He shared his journey with them, using his own experiences to help others see that transformation was possible, even from the darkest of places. One evening, he received an invitation from the community center where he often volunteered. They were holding an awards ceremony to recognize individuals who had made a significant impact in the lives of the community members. And to his surprise, he was on the guest list as an honoree. As he arrived at the ceremony, he was greeted by warm smiles and familiar faces. He looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people who had supported him along his journey, those who had seen his potential even when he couldn't see it himself. The ceremony was simple yet meaningful, each honoree taking a moment to share a few words. When it was his turn, he stepped up to the podium, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He spoke from the heart, sharing not only his story, but the lessons he had learned about resilience, empathy, and respect. I learned that true strength doesn't come from titles or power, he said, his voice steady and clear. It comes from standing up for yourself and others, from having the courage to face who you are and who you want to become. And it's about knowing that each of us has the power to inspire change, not just in ourselves, but in the lives of those around us. As he finished, the room filled with applause, and Miles felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had come so far, from a place of quiet endurance to a life filled with purpose, one that was touching others in ways he had never dreamed possible. After the ceremony, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. Your story, it reminded me of my own struggles, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've given me hope that I can change my life, too. Miles smiled, his heart swelling with pride. You absolutely can, he said warmly. The journey isn't easy, but I promise you, it's worth every step. As the night drew to a close, Miles stood outside, looking up at the stars with a quiet sense of fulfillment. His journey had been long, filled with challenges, triumphs, and unexpected turns. But through it all, he had found his voice, his purpose, and his place in the world. And though he knew that life would continue to bring new challenges, he also knew that he was ready to face them, stronger, wiser, and more grounded than ever before. His story wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. As the seasons changed, so did the course of Miles' life. His work and studies became a rhythm he found deeply fulfilling. Each day, a new opportunity to reach people, to help them see the strength within themselves. He had become a figure of respect in the community, and his story continued to ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. One late winter evening, as he was wrapping up a group session at the community center, Miles noticed a young man waiting in the corner of the room. The man's face was shadowed, but there was an unmistakable look of determination in his eyes. As the others left, the young man approached him, nervously wringing his hands. "Are you Miles Daniels?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles nodded, smiling warmly. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The man took a deep breath. "My name is Eli, and I need help," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I heard your story at a talk you gave a while back, and it stuck with me. I've been going through some things I don't know how to handle." Miles gestured to the seat next to him, encouraging Eli to sit. He could sense that Eli was carrying a weight, one that he wasn't sure he could bear alone. "What's going on, Eli?" Miles asked gently, his voice steady and encouraging. Eli hesitated, then began to speak, his words tumbling out in fragments. He talked about his struggles with self-worth, about feeling trapped in a life that seemed to move without him. He spoke of the fear of not being good enough, the pressure of trying to fit into a world that seemed indifferent to his pain. As Eli spoke, Miles listened intently, his heart resonating with the familiar ache in the young man's words. He could feel the rawness, the uncertainty that Eli carried. It reminded him of his own journey, of the days when he had felt invisible, his worth defined by others. "You know," Miles said softly when Eli finished, "I've been there too, feeling like the world doesn't see you, like you're struggling just to keep your head above water. But here's the thing. I learned that the real journey isn't about fitting into the world's expectations. It's about finding your own worth, your own voice, and learning to stand by it." Eli looked at him, his eyes widening with a spark of hope. "Do you think that I could get there too? To that place where I feel at peace with myself?" Miles nodded, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I know you can. It won't be easy, and it will take time. But you're already here, taking the first step. That takes courage, Eli." Over the following weeks, Eli returned regularly, working with Miles through his challenges, slowly discovering his own resilience. As they talked, laughed, and even shed a few tears together, Miles found himself growing alongside Eli, each session deepening his understanding of the human spirit and its capacity for transformation. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session, Eli looked at him with a newfound confidence. "Miles," he said, a small grin tugging at his lips, "I used to think people like you were just lucky, that you had something I could never have. But now I see, it's not about luck, is it?" Miles chuckled, feeling a warm pride swelling within him. "No, Eli. It's about making a choice every day to be true to yourself, even when it's hard." Their bond grew into something beyond counselor and client. Eli became a friend, someone who reminded Miles of the reason he had started this journey. And in turn, Eli found a mentor who helped him see his own strength, his own capacity to shape his life with integrity and courage. As spring blossomed, bringing a sense of renewal to the city, Miles received another surprise. A letter arrived at the community center, addressed to him in a familiar, elegant handwriting. He opened it with a sense of curiosity, finding a carefully penned note inside. "Dear Miles," it read, "It's been some time and I've done a lot of thinking. I wanted you to know that I've continued on the path you helped set me on. I'm learning, growing, and giving back where I can. I'm not perfect and I'm still healing, but I hope that someday I can make amends in the ways that truly matter. Thank you again for showing me a new way." It was signed simply, Rebecca. Miles felt a sense of closure and pride settle over him as he read her words. She was changing, not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent ways, a testament to the power of transformation. He felt a deep satisfaction knowing that his journey had planted seeds that continued to bloom, even in places he couldn't see. Inspired by her letter, Miles felt compelled to do more. He organized a small team at the community center to host workshops, sharing skills for self-confidence, resilience, and respect. He invited people from all walks of life, young, old, those facing hardship, and those simply seeking a deeper sense of purpose. He shared his story, his hard-won insights, and encouraged others to find their own strength in ways that resonated with their unique journeys. The workshops became a success, drawing more people each week. Stories of hope and resilience filled the air. people bonding over shared challenges and newfound courage. Miles watched with pride as others stood up to share their own tales of growth, each voice adding to the collective strength of the group. His heart swelled as he witnessed people coming alive, inspired by each other, embracing the power they held within. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Eli approached him with a thoughtful expression. "Miles," he began, "I think it's time I help others the way you help me. You've shown me that it's possible to turn pain into strength, and I want to be part of that journey for others." Miles beamed, clapping a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I think that's an incredible idea, Eli. You have so much to give, and I know you'll make a real difference." In the following months, Eli became an active member of the community center, working with Miles to lead sessions, offering his own story as a beacon of hope for others. Together, they created a ripple effect, touching the lives of countless people who, in turn, began to inspire those around them. And then, one summer evening, the community center received a major recognition, a grant to expand their services, enabling them to reach even more people. At the award ceremony, Miles was asked to speak, to share the vision that had fueled his work. He stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, friends, mentors, strangers who had become part of this incredible journey. As he spoke, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, realizing that he was no longer just the man who had stood up to Vivian. He was a part of something much larger, something that had taken on a life of its own. "We each have the power to create change," he said, his voice strong and steady. "Not by forcing others to see our worth, but by finding it within ourselves. I've learned that our lives are like seeds, each action we take planting the potential for something beautiful. And it's our responsibility to nurture that, to make sure the seeds we plant grow into something meaningful." The audience erupted in applause, the energy in the room alive with hope and pride. Miles felt a sense of completion, a knowledge that he had not only changed his own life, but had helped others believe in the possibility of change. As the evening drew to a close, he stepped outside, breathing in the warm summer air. Standing beside him, Eli looked out at the horizon, a peaceful smile on his face. "You know, Miles," he said, "if you hadn't taken that stand all those years ago, none of this would be happening. We wouldn't be here." Miles nodded, feeling the weight of his journey come full circle. "It's amazing, isn't it? How one decision can ripple out and touch so many lives." Eli looked at him, admiration shining in his eyes. "Thank you for everything. You didn't just help me. You showed me that my life could have purpose, that I could be someone who matters." Miles smiled, his heart full. "You were always someone who mattered, Eli. You just needed to see it for yourself." As they stood there together, under the vast expanse of the evening sky, Miles knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more triumphs, more lives to touch. And with each step, he felt a quiet, unbreakable strength within him, a reminder of everything he had overcome and everything he had yet to become. In that moment, he realized that his journey would continue, a story that would live on, not just in him, but in everyone he had inspired along the way. As summer faded into autumn, Miles' work at the community center continued to grow, each day bringing new faces and stories that deepened his commitment to helping others. His workshops had become a sanctuary for those seeking understanding, a place where people felt free to share their vulnerabilities and find strength in one another. The room often filled with laughter, sometimes tears, but always a sense of shared resilience. One evening, after a particularly powerful session, Miles was approached by an elderly woman he hadn't seen before. She was small in stature, her face marked by the lines of age and experience, yet her eyes held a spark that hinted at a lifetime of stories. "Mr. Daniels?" she asked, her voice gentle but confident. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a warm smile. "And you are?" "My name is Agnes," she said, her voice tinged with something familiar and wise. "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here. My grandson, Eli, has told me so much about you. He says you've changed his life." Miles felt a surge of warmth as he remembered Eli, who had become not only a regular, but a vital part of their community center family. He smiled, touched by her gratitude. Eli is remarkable. I may have given him a nudge, but he found his strength on his own. Agnes nodded, a glint of pride in her eyes. That may be, but sometimes people need that nudge. You helped him see what he couldn't see in himself. And for that, I am forever grateful. They talked for a while longer, and as she shared snippets of Eli's life, Miles realized how deeply his actions had resonated, not just with Eli but with his family as well. It was a reminder that his work wasn't just about individuals. It was about the ripple effect that extended far beyond what he could see. As they parted ways, Agnes reached into her bag and handed him a small, hand-bound journal. "I thought you might appreciate this," she said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "I write stories, and this one, well, it's about resilience, about finding strength in unlikely places. I think you'll enjoy it." Miles took the journal, touched by her gesture. "Thank you, Agnes. I'll treasure it." The next morning, he sat by his window, sipping coffee and flipping through the journal. Agnes' words were beautifully written, each page filled with stories of resilience and transformation. He felt as if he were peering into the lives of countless people who had faced struggles with courage and grace. Her words reminded him of the universality of pain and the extraordinary beauty of overcoming it. Days later, he found himself sharing some of Agnes' stories with his workshop attendees. The stories sparked deep, reflective conversations, and many people stayed afterward, eager to share their own experiences. One man, who had always been quiet and reserved, spoke up about his journey through addiction and the fight to rebuild his life. His words brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the room, his vulnerability resonating deeply with the group. Over time, Agnes' stories became a staple of their sessions, each tale serving as a reminder that resilience came in many forms, and that strength could be found even in the darkest moments. Miles saw how the stories united people, bridging their differences and bringing them closer. One evening, he received an unexpected email from a major nonprofit organization that worked with at-risk youth across the country. They had heard about his work at the community center and wanted to collaborate on a project that would bring his workshops to cities beyond his own. They envisioned a traveling series of workshops, led by Miles and his team, to reach young people who were struggling to find direction and self-worth. Miles was stunned by the proposal. The idea of expanding his work on a national scale felt both thrilling and daunting, but he knew that this was a chance to make an even greater impact. He shared the news with Eli and the rest of the team, their excitement mirroring his own. Together, they began to plan the logistics, discussing cities, dates, and how they could make the workshops as accessible and impactful as possible. In the months that followed, they traveled across the country, setting up workshops in community centers, schools, and shelters. Each city brought new faces and stories, people who carried their own burdens but found comfort in the shared experiences of the group. Miles led each session with empathy, drawing on his own journey to connect with the attendees on a personal level. One evening, in a small town on the outskirts of Chicago, a young woman approached him after a workshop. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting as she searched for the right words. "Miles, I don't know if you remember me," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "But I was there at the restaurant that night. I saw what happened with that woman who tried to tear you down. I didn't say anything then, and I've regretted it ever since." Miles felt a pang of surprise as he took in her words. Memories of that night flooded back, the emotions he had long since let go of. He met her gaze, offering a gentle smile. "Thank you for telling me," he replied. "But you don't need to feel guilty. That moment is what set me on this path. I'm grateful for it now." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "You taught me that it's okay to stand up for myself. Watching you that night gave me the courage to leave a toxic relationship, to finally believe that I deserved better. I never thought I'd have the chance to tell you that, but thank you." Miles felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a reminder of the far-reaching impact of his actions. He embraced her words with humility, knowing that his journey had connected with hers in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The traveling workshops grew, and as they visited city after city, Miles and his team found themselves welcomed with open arms. Their message of resilience and self-worth resonated with people from all backgrounds. Each session a tapestry of stories woven together by shared humanity. One evening, after a particularly powerful session in a small coastal town, Miles found himself sitting on a dock, watching the waves crash against the shore. Eli joined him, settling down beside him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Eli said after a moment of silence, "when I first met you, I thought my life was too broken to fix. But now, I feel like anything is possible. And it's because of you, Miles." Miles smiled, his heart filled with pride for Eli's journey. "You did that yourself, Eli. I just helped you see what was already there." Eli nodded, looking out at the dark, endless ocean. "Still, I wouldn't be here without you. And I want to keep this going, even after the workshops are over. I want to help others see what they're capable of, just like you helped me." They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Miles felt a sense of peace, knowing that Eli had found his own path, one that would continue to uplift others. He realized that his legacy was no longer just his own. It was a collective journey, shared by the lives he had touched. As the stars emerged one by one, illuminating the vast night sky, Miles felt a profound gratitude settle over him. He had started this journey with a simple desire for respect, for dignity, but it had transformed into something far greater, a mission to inspire, to heal, to connect. He knew there would be more challenges, more people who needed a light to guide them. And he was ready, strengthened by the countless stories that had become part of his own. Miles had become not just a voice for change, but a catalyst, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple out and touch the world in unimaginable ways. In that quiet moment, sitting beside Eli, Miles understood that his story was a living, breathing testament to the power of resilience. He was no longer the man who stood up to adversity alone. He was part of a legacy of hope, of humanity, and of a strength that transcended words. And as the waves crashed against the shore, Miles felt the steady rhythm of his purpose, as timeless and unbreakable as the ocean itself. As Miles and Eli sat in comfortable silence, the quiet night was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. They both turned to see a figure silhouetted by the moonlight, moving steadily toward them. As the figure drew closer, Miles felt a prickle of recognition. It was Rebecca. Dressed in simple clothes, her once polished demeanor was softened by an air of humility and determination. She paused a few feet away, her gaze fixed on Miles with an intensity that held a mix of hope and something unspoken. "Rebecca," he said, surprised but calm, "what brings you here?" She took a deep breath, her voice steady but carrying a hint of urgency. "Miles, I've spent the past few months working on myself, trying to undo the damage I caused. But the more I've tried to move forward, the more I've realized I'm not done. I need to be part of this, of what you're building here. I want to help people like you helped me, and I think I finally know how." Eli's eyes darted between them, his expression a mix of shock and curiosity. Miles studied Rebecca's face, searching for any trace of insincerity, but all he found was a raw honesty, an eagerness to turn her past into something meaningful. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, a message from the director of the nonprofit they had partnered with for the traveling workshops. The words were simple, yet loaded with urgency. Asterisk, "We have a problem. We need to talk, now." Asterisk. A shiver ran down his spine as he looked up at Rebecca and Eli, both of whom were watching him with anticipation. His mind raced, sensing that whatever was happening was larger than any of them had anticipated. "Rebecca," he said, his tone serious, "if you're ready to face your past, to do the real work, maybe we do have a place for you. But understand, this isn't just about making up for what happened. It's about building something bigger, something that can change lives." Rebecca nodded, her expression resolute. "I understand. I'm ready to give everything I have." Eli placed a reassuring hand on Miles' shoulder. "Whatever this is, we're in it together." Miles exhaled, nodding. "All right, but let's be clear. All of this, the workshops, the lives we've touched, it's only the beginning. We're about to face challenges we couldn't have imagined. and I don't know where this road is going to take us." The three of them stood there, a quiet determination settling over them as they looked out at the endless horizon. Then Miles turned to the camera, his eyes filled with purpose. "And for everyone watching, we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think of this journey so far? Share your own stories, your struggles, your triumphs. Spread the word. Share this video with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel to see where this journey leads us. Because trust me, all of this—" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It's only just beginning.